So these are big questions we're thinking about in our world today. Who really does decide what we're taxed and where we're going to war and who is going to die? Where does sovereignty lie? Who truly has the power? And Foucault's response to this, I think people really need to pay attention to. He really has something to say here. And for Foucault, when there's a king in power, it's kind of obvious to see who is in power. You could direct your energy and your anger, fear, admiration at the king. But there was an inverse of power, very sleight of hands that Foucault identifies. And he would say there's sort of an inversion. This is part of the secrets of empire. The oligarchs end up finding these cutout forms of government. Um, the republics and their administrators, or the democratic governments, and they, in a sense, are really to operate those cave paintings so effectively when there's this appearance that that is the only government. And I want you to listen to closely here when Foucault talks about biopolitics, and just think of deep state phenomena when you listen to this, please. So Foucault says that initially imposed from outside, this is what biopolitics is all about, or what he's calling biopower. Initially, it's kind of coming from the outside. We could see the king, and his sovereignty comes from his ability to decide who lives and who dies. But something happens. Biopower becomes internalized. The source of power remains the source of power who really controls the fundamental policies that come out of the capitals throughout the world. Who controls that remains elusive to current research models and social science and humanities. That's what we're doing here on Dr. Deep State. We're trying to understand why these methods are elusive, who's pulling the ropes, the strings, calling the shots, and what's the agenda. And I believe Foucault here has something to say. So he says, what's going on here is the power became internalized. How did that happen? Well, modern power became encoded into social practices and human behavior with gradual acquiescences to the subtle regulations of the social order. We could go into that forever, but every time you see something, and there used to be objections to this war or this police action, and of course we're living in a day, whatever president, we're bombing them, we're droning them, no reaction anymore. He's saying we've acquiesced so much of our power away that you get terms like zombie nation and so forth. Finally, Foucault said it makes possible the emergence of modern nation state and capitalism. This form of biopower that he's talking about literally controls internally. It was the power that created the nation state. Think of the Westphalian nation state construction in 1648. It was there, says Foucault. The deep state was operating in the very construction of that. Capitalism and the forces behind it. And of course, we're not talking about free market capitalism. We're talking about oligarchical capitalism, controlled capitalism, designed to control and engineer human beings, as Foucault would say. And finally, as I've argued in my series, it was there, the deep state biopower, in the construction of the United States, which is an evolving federalism, Federalist number 10, which became the model for Kant and world federalism, the political economic piece that would be juxtaposed against the esoteric piece and the final piece of this project. So for Foucault, he's really talking about the secrets of empire. And what's he doing? How they operate, getting through the elusiveness a little bit, and the final game plan of these oligarchs. And I will argue again, the question Foucault wants to get to here is who decides. We know it was the king in that political order, but we're talking about a deep state political order. We finally know it's out there. There is a deep state. Who are they? What they're doing? He's saying the important question is, they're the ones, the true state, the deep state, who's really calling the shots. They get to decide who lives and who dies. Yet maybe they can decide who goes to prison, who goes to a war. But at the end of the day, as this agenda is getting rolling out, it becomes even more fundamental than that. And I'm going to say that there's two readings of Foucault we need to consider here. The exoteric, which you're getting largely at the university, talking about gay studies or whatever else he might be talking about. Some of it's very valuable even in the institutions when he thinks about institutions, educational prison institutions, and how we internalize this knowledge. But I'm going to argue here that there is an esoteric Foucault. He's really putting this out there. And was he an insider? Well, he speaks like one. Um, but biopower, for him, the exoteric meaning, it's these mechanisms of control over the body and the mind. And it arrived especially in the 19th century with the advance of Darwinism. Darwinism is where this power, it takes its magical formula with the turn with Darwin. And so that's a loaded concept here, but we're just going over the superficial kind of speaking of it. So what's he talking about with the secrets of empire here, Michel Foucault, as he's writing in the 1970s? He said there's a transition in terms of how power worked in the Roman Empire from some of the previous empires, but especially that mode of empire, the project which I've argued throughout, there is one empire mode. Foucault is agreeing. There's a dominant mode. Sometimes it shows its face. In the modern times, it tends not to, but part of the plan is it will begin to show its face again as the hierarchy becomes externalized. It incorporates into a politics of truth or public opinion. Again, that Platonic idea, it controls the information, giving the subjects the idea that they're freedom of choice or that there's options available. But again, it's a controlled dialectic at hand. And Foucault very much gets that. And he's saying that, in a sense, this Westphalian system, this modern phase of this, the state system that we know of that was created in 1648, sort of transmogrified the Roman ancient mode of empire. And again, it was the first form of having cutouts, these states that would seemingly have their various choices of political power, whether they be princes or, the modern isms, right and left, and socialism and so forth. But he said, here we have the perfect protection racket. And this is probably generated to some extent by the British India Trading Company and the way they, as corporatized a country or continent, and then put in their political apparatus as a means of protecting the subjects, giving them a choice of two, of the lesser of two evils. But he's really talking here about something, and here's where I'm going to get to what's intense about what Foucault is speaking of, because it's so similar to what we talked about, the One Empire project, this sort of the great work and the end of the great work. And let me read here what Foucault has to say. And trust me, you will hear this nowhere else. So he's talking about, with the advance of Darwinism, the beginning of a certain type of genetic manipulation that we can hail way back to Plato and his creation of this sort of guardian class over the plebes, in order to make some sort of perfect state. This was always an underlying objective, but with the advent of Darwinism and his notion of evolution, the age-old idea of alchemy, human involvement in evolution that was always sort of a secret craft, is now put out there as public policy. And Foucault says it like this. Get the reflection off my glasses. It will become the discourse of a battle that has been waged not between two races, but by a race that is portrayed as the one true race, the race that holds power and is entitled to define the norm, and against those who deviate from that norm, against those who pose a threat to the biological heritage. So what we're talking about here with the deep state, we can talk about Obama and Trump and some bureaucracy. This is it. This is the plan. There's an unveiling of this plan. And none of this matters unless we think to ourselves, what does this mean to us? How do we fit into it? Do we have free will? And if so, what are the actual options that we have here in terms of choosing our own physical and perhaps spiritual destiny? And Foucault continues, then there's going to be this one group. At this point, he's saying in this dialectic, and he might be talking about some of the race battles of the 19th century and some of what was going on inside of the workings of empire and colonial powers versus imperial powers and so forth. But he's saying it gets twisted and internalized into something new. At this point, we have all those biological racist discourses of degeneracy. Of course, he's talking about the eugenics debates, the ideal race and family, and that being institutionalized in the late 19th, early 20th century. But also those institutions within the social body, which make the discourse of race struggle function as a principle of exclusion and segregation, and ultimately as a way of normalizing society. And what he's saying here, and we can get to this down the road, this eugenics project of creating this ideal people, this age-old Platonic project of kind of making that perfect triangle, a certain social order, never went away. And it's being highlighted with the debates about eugenics in the 19th and early 20th century. But what he's going to say here, then, is the biopolitical war is what the deep state is waging against us. It's rumbling away, says Foucault. Beneath the political power is a secret, primitive, and permanent, a war that consists of power relations between social groups. And here I'll put this in the footnotes. I'm grabbing from 5 different articles and books to put this next little section together. He says it consistently, but I grabbed this together from 5 different sources, what I'm about to speak, okay? So initially, the discourse posted a racial binary consisting of 2 groups or races at war with each other, the purple, the green, fill in the blank. However, by the end of the 19th century, the theory of permanent race struggle was no longer seen as a binary or antagonism. It was recasted, French to English, recasted within the theory of evolutionism and the struggle for existence. No longer a single antagonism, but one true race from which certain groups or individuals deviated. This discourse does not lend itself to rational investigation. And these pieces that are found about in Foucault's work never make it into the discourse of the university. So he is saying, as I have suggested by a number of other authors and will continue to, this is one project of empire with one great work. And that great work is the construction of a master race, and all policies that emanate from that class will decide what is normal and what is abnormal, what can be discussed and what cannot be discussed, and ultimately who lives and who dies.